So, yes, welcome everybody to tonight's lecture. This is a CP Writing Clinic lecture, and it is specifically on the third draft of your CPs. But keep in mind, at the very end of tonight's lecture, I'll also be pointing forward a little bit to what we'd like you to do in your fourth draft. So this will pick up on some of the materials that Xander and myself posted on Facebook today about how to synthesize your survey data and interview data into different sections of the CP. So in order to illustrate how you do this, I'm just going to show some best practice examples from previous semesters to help illustrate what the final product should look like and how you do that effectively. But please keep in mind that those other materials are also to be used in conjunction with what I talk about tonight. So you have the two sections in textbook to read on SurveyMonkey, and also you have the best practice examples long read that we put up today. So keep in mind the tip clip that was going to be on SurveyMonkey and how to synthesize that in your data will essentially be the final component of the lecture today. So for everyone who's watching live and everyone who is watching the video later, the last 10 minutes will be the tip clip. Okay, so it's specifically dedicated to talking about how you include that data in the fourth draft. So by the end of tonight's session, you should have a number of different things that you will take away from it. So one, I want you to be able to apply the necessary writing tools for a management book. So again, this will relate to things like the tone of the management book, the level of detail that we want you to go into a management book, and also the degree of specificity we want you to go into a management book, i.e. keeping things leadership orientated in all of your discussions across the different elements of the CP. I'll also reiterate, and this is something that you've probably heard me say a lot in the team talks, and as I often say in those team talks, when I was a younger person and studying, I would often ignore this advice as well. But now, having learned a bit more over the years, I would really encourage everybody to allocate a specific role to someone in the team to edit, proofread, and revise your CP. So just give someone 2, 3, 4, 5 hours before the hand-in time to read over everything, to make sure that it's coherent, to make sure that points link together, and to make sure that there are no kind of recurring spelling and grammatical errors and so forth. By the end of tonight, you should also be able to learn from best practice examples to improve your CPs for your fourth draft. So again, I'm going to show some best practice examples from most teams. Again, if your team isn't included, that isn't I'm not casting aspersions on your team necessarily. It's just I have to select some things, so it takes a lot of time to go back over the CPs and find some specific comments that I think illustrate a larger or more recurring problem. So if you don't see your team mentioned in either the positives or the things to improve on, don't think that I don't like your team's draft or anything. I have to select some teams. So inevitably, some will be featured, some may be left out. And the whole purpose of this is for you guys to try to strive to avoid some of those commonly seen errors that we see all the time. So again, it's perfectly normal to see these things, but as we move from the first, second, third, and subsequently fourth draft at the weekend, we want to really see some of these basic errors eliminated, okay? And then finally, as I say, I'll incorporate the tip clip element into the end of tonight's lecture. And I'm going to point forward a bit to show you guys how you can synthesize your interview and survey data into your CP. So I'll do that from showing some best practice examples from previous semesters from Team Bahamas and Team Nigeria. So I'll show you specific sections that they've written, the interview sections themselves, the survey sections themselves, but also other sections where they've kind of woven in and synthesized that survey and interview data to add extra richness or to add examples to some of the other points that they're making in other sections. So please keep in mind, if you saw in your third draft feedback and other feedback that I'm continually saying, please show a concrete example or please show an illustrative example of something. The survey data and the interview data is a perfect way through which to do that. It helps to make the chapters more richer, more colourful, but also more specific and orientated towards the country that you're studying. Keep in mind, as I said in Team Talks this week, The chapters are standardized. So ultimately, at the end, one of the main ways in which each chapter distinguishes itself from those that come before and after it is through the use of native terms, through the use of native authors, and also through these concrete examples from organizations in the different countries that help bring it to life and give insight into what it's like to actually work in these organizations in the country you're studying. So that's what you guys should know by the end of tonight. So this was the third draft, obviously, and in the team talks this week with both myself and Xander, we've been going over the feedback. Okay, so this has been via Zoom, of course, and what we're looking for you to do before Sunday, as always, when you get feedback, is to engage with it and try and resolve the comments. And ultimately, if you feel like you have resolved the comments, delete the comments. Okay, this is something that I'll come back to say a little bit later. That there were still some teams that had lots of comments in the third draft from previous versions that just hadn't been polished up yet. So again, create that kind of impression with each draft that it's a kind of final product that you're handing in. So there shouldn't be any old comments that are still needing to be resolved. If you do have a particular question that you want to ask to me in the draft or Xander, then by all means, leave a comment in saying, we've tried to do this here. We tried to take your feedback on board. Do you think we've achieved it? And so forth. So then when I do give you feedback in the next draft, I can engage with that and say, you have, but you could also do this, or that's great, guys. And then I can delete the comment and you know that that's been resolved. So please try and keep things clean in that respect. So this is what's coming up with the fourth draft. So obviously your major task is to update all of the old comments and all of the feedback from your third draft. By this stage, we want to be becoming closer and closer to a final end product, which means we really want to see some of those basic kind of errors eliminated at this stage. Things are starting to become quite real now, okay? We also want to see you add some additional sections. So primarily, we want you to include the survey results and what local respondents say. So all of the material that's been put on Facebook today will help you to achieve just that. At the end of the lecture tonight, as I say, I'll also show you and talk a little bit about what those chapters should look like, what those sections should look like. So you need to include extracts from your Sumo open-ended answers and your interview transcripts. So this is quite a good point to make this, or quite a good time to make this point to everybody. If you have not completed an interview yet and you don't think that you will do so by Sunday, please get in touch with one of us and we can talk to you about it. If you have already transcribed your interviews, but you have yet to highlight certain sections that you think are useful for your CP, you need to email me and say, okay, Chris, our interview transcripts are ready, and I can give you feedback on those transcripts. But remember, you guys need to highlight in any color you like what sections, what quotes, what examples you think are good and powerful and impactful to use in your CP. If you email me then, I can then give you feedback in your OneDrive folder saying, this section looks really good. Perhaps you could include that in your empathy section. This looks like a nice example that you could perhaps include in your introduction to capture the quintessence of what leadership is like in Slovakia, Liechtenstein, Peru, Cameroon, whatever it is. Okay. Next, you need to complete the section Leadership Scholar and Cross-Cultural Trainer. So again, this should be the two different interviews, the SoundCloud interview and the interview which will eventually be on YouTube. But all we need to see at this stage is a summarizing of what those interviews are. So a summarization of the 3 or 4 main points that emerged from both of those interviews. And remember, you can also use that interview data in other sections of your CP to illustrate something, summarize something, to lend evidence for the claims that you're making about what hierarchy is like in the organizations in your country, or how leaders display empathy, for example. If you can get good data from these interviews, that's what we want to see in the CP, to illustrate, support, clarify, explain, give more detail and richness. Okay? So as per usual, all of these sections need to include in-text sourcing, which should also be added to your bibliography. So hopefully at this stage, after having done the midterm exam, Everybody should now be very familiar with the bibliography chapter in textbook that you read in preparation for that. So again, we really want to see everyone getting the referencing down now at this stage. So I'll show some examples later, perhaps, of where some teams can still improve on that. And I have to commend you guys as well, based on feedback from the previous CP clinic about keeping the draft folders clean. I'm pleased to say that every single draft in the third draft had a clean folder, in the sense that there was only one document in the folder. And it's really good. It makes it so much easier to mark, particularly when you're marking quite a lot of them back to back. So again, thank you for that. Please, let's do that with the fourth draft. Just make sure you have one document, which is the most up-to-date version of your CP. Now, I'm highlighting this because, as you may be aware from previous lectures over the weeks, I would tend to highlight in red the different kind of sections that you were working on at that particular time for the particular draft. This is the first time we've been able to scale back all the way to really say, okay, guys, this is it now. We're really starting to work on the whole document now. So all of the sections in some shape or form are now all included in this fourth draft. And remember, once a section's completed as such, it's never properly completed. What you write later on in a CP might impact what you have written at the beginning. So even if you feel like, based on our team talks and the feedback that you've received from me and Xander, that your introduction's okay or good enough, doesn't mean that you can just leave it there. You should always be editing, re-editing, and refining the information based on other things that you perhaps find out later on. So, for example, if you suddenly find a really interesting argument from your surveys and from your interviewee data, then it might mean that you have to go back to your introduction and weave in and introduce some of those arguments earlier in order to create consistency across the different sections. So from now on, from this point, I really want you to see that you're continually working on a finished product, an overall product that will look something like this, like the finished book. So again, this is it's really about getting into that mindset now that every time you do a draft, you're trying to write and prepare for it and edit it and proofread it and get it to a level of quality that suggests that that is the final version. Okay, so keep this book in mind. Keep in mind the goal that you all have, which is to be published authors and to be named and listed in this book. Okay. And we don't have long to go now. So again, let yourself fall in love with the book. Let the book fall in love with you. Try and embrace your teammates. Try and work hard together. Help each other. Support each other. Make sure everyone's sort of pulling their weight, but equally make sure that people have support if they need it. And keep in mind, the course isn't forever. So try and really put everything you have into it over the next month or so. And then after that, everybody can celebrate and have a nice holiday. And remember, there is lots of different types of help still available. So obviously, I and Xander are both getting emails every day about certain things, and we try our best to obviously respond to all of them. I know I'm certainly up to date in relation to emails and different things. So that's one option. Obviously, textbook is also your first option. So please have a quick look at that before you ask a question to make sure that it hasn't been discussed there. And that saves up space for other students who have particular questions that are more pressing. So check textbook first. If you still can't find an answer, then please get in touch with us. There are also writing classes and Xander's web lecture on writing as well. Also my CP clinic lecture and other lectures that relate to different sections, to interviews, to contacting, all the different elements that you're still using in your CP, and then obviously the feedback that you're getting from Xander and myself each week on your drafts. And at this stage, you need to really be thinking about the idea that you're producing a single document. And that's why earlier I said it's really important to entrust this particular role to someone. So someone who is doing other jobs, but also has the principal responsibility to gently read over in a preferably calm state 4 or 5 hours before handing and tries to weave everything together. Does this section link to the next one? If you finished on one point, should this paragraph follow up on it? Is there an example that you could use in order to support a point that you make there? Is a sentence grammatically awkward? Does there seem something strange about it? When you read it out loud, do you suddenly become short of breath because the sentence is too long? If so, try and edit yourself or speak to the person who wrote the chapter and ask them to clarify that section. Okay, so now it's really about trying to create consistency across the different sections to make sure that the quality is maintained across each section, that the writing is similar, and that it feels like it's written by a singular author, even if it's written by 2 or 3 authors. Now, this isn't so much of an issue anymore, so again, I commend you guys for it, for taking that feedback on board, but there are still certain ways in which sometimes the readability is an issue. So one is when sentences are just awkwardly phrased, or they're not clear enough, in which case you'll have seen me give comments saying, this doesn't make sense, please clarify, this is awkward, amend, rephrase, etc. Everything we're trying to do is geared towards readability. Ultimately, we're trying to make the text readable for a general readership. So not necessarily specialists in leadership or specialists in your country. And that's quite an important point because I've been saying this in team talks this week. Sometimes teams are saying things which sound quite complex. They're introducing a concept or an idea. And very often they just leave it there. And what happens is that it's up to my imagination or another reader's imagination to think, I think they mean this, and I think that connects to hierarchy or empathy because of these reasons. What you need to do is to avoid that. You don't want to leave things up to the reader's imagination here. You want to demonstrate your knowledge and understanding by explaining, clarifying, summarizing, and concluding on what something means, showing concrete examples, okay? So you need to make sure that sometimes things aren't left too vague, too ambiguous, or sometimes too academic. It's okay to assume a certain level of knowledge on our part when talking about power distance and empathy. You don't have to define them or use big quotes to say what they are. But what you can't do is just name certain concepts or ideas, okay, and assume that the general reader will know. You rather need to explain your knowledge and understanding of them by explaining. And conversely, you also need to make sure not to write too informally either. So this is much, much better each time you guys hand in a draft, but there are still some examples where people are still using certain phrases like nowadays, certain words nowadays. Mentions came up quite a lot in this most recent draft. People would say Hofstede or some other scholar mentions that leadership is like this. And what I would say is that mentions is just too informal. Okay, mentions is something that you would do to a friend. I mentioned that I saw another friend at a shop recently. So scholars are doing something a bit more than mentioning. They're arguing, they're positing, they're stating, they're explaining, they're purporting. Lots of different words for it, and I've suggested some of these words that you can use in your individual comments. Also in OneDrive downloads folder, as I'll show later, there's also a phrase bank that you can use to that you can copy and paste essentially. Okay, but try and keep those descriptions formal. Another thing is to make sure that you're using a UK spell checker. So quite a lot, the easy way of identifying it is that we're still seeing a lot of Zs in quite a lot of the CPs. And very often you'll see me changing them direct. But if I change 3 or 4 of them, I'm probably not going to change every single one in your CP at this stage. So if you do see me doing that a lot, please go through the rest of your CP and try and eliminate as many of those naughty Zs as possible. Sorry, American students, but we're using UK English on the course, so S's preferably. There I go. Now, I mentioned this earlier, but I want to highlight it again because I think it's absolutely vital and it would increase every single CP's mark a little bit for each section if they went through this simple process. Remember, individual mistakes in themselves aren't that bad, and sometimes people might think, oh, why is Chris constantly nitpicking? What a geek, what a loser, why is he obsessing about commas and various things like that? Fair point, I know, I can be a bit annoying like that, but at the same time, these things build up. And if you're continually seeing multiple easy spelling and grammatical errors over the course of multiple sentences, then it creates an impression that it was done last minute at times. and it also creates an impression that someone hasn't read over it to check for those basic errors. I know everybody's working very hard. I know English isn't everybody's first language, and I'm incredibly impressed by how amazing your English is. So much so that sometimes I forget and I just talk as if everyone is British or a fluent English speaker. And I am sympathetic in that respect, that it's hard to write if it's not your first language. But there are some things that can be eliminated by a simple UK spell checker that will pick up on those errors. It will suggest ways you can change them and improve them and write them properly. So if you're not already, please run things through a UK spell checker. So this is a review, edit and rewrite process, 3-stage process, and I would recommend that everybody tries to do this in relation to each section and sometimes each paragraph even. So again, if you're writing something in a hierarchy or empathy section, double check that the question has been answered. Have we actually talked about hierarchy? Have we kept to talking about hierarchy? Or have we drifted to talking about other things? Other things that at one point seemed related, but the more we talk about them, the more and more we drift away. So have somebody check for that. Guys, I don't think that relates to empathy. Do we have any more stuff that specifically mentions empathy? Could this person check the interview transcripts again? Could this person check the surveys again? We need stuff on empathy. Could we do another literature search? Etc. Make sure that arguments are supported with sufficient evidence. So again, when you're making particular claims, this country has an autocratic leadership style, but in recent years it has shifted to more traditional leadership styles. If that's just left there, it's unclear where you're getting that information from, and it's also unclear whether that's a valid claim or not. An easy way to make sure that all your points are valid is to cite an academic reference. An academic reference will lend support for the argument that you're making. Okay, so it helps to justify, legitimize, and validate what you're reading. You want to then check if the structure of the essay is coherent. So again, does each sentence lead logically onto the next? If you're talking about one thing here and then the next sentence just starts as if that never happened, then that's not a good narrative flow. So you want to use signal phrases, as I'll show later, that help to transition. You're clarifying, sum up, you introduce the next point, you move on, you talk about that, and you try and make sure that sentences link to one another. Sounds simple, and I sound annoyed by myself saying it, but it's really, really important. It makes all the difference in terms of making something flow well and looking like it's been written by people who are thinking about what they're doing. Again, sometimes it's very easy to get caught up in the act of just writing things and saying, I've put in this information, that information's there, Chris. It's not all about information. Information is vital. It's also how you put it together. You need to synthesize it into a story. You need to take charge of it. What comes first? What example do we have to illustrate that? Okay, so each paragraph needs to have a clear, logical structure. It needs to start general, needs to become more and more specific. So by the end, it ends in a very specific example, and you're ready to move on to another paragraph. I said this a lot, but please make sure someone reads it out loud. I can't stress enough how valuable or invaluable this is. You immediately realize if something sounds clunky. If you think, oh, that's hard to say, probably means it's hard to read. If you're out of breath, it probably means the sentence is too long. If you stammer and get confused over how to phrase things, it probably means that it's not written simply and it's too complicated and too vague. So again, reading it out loud gently 4 or 5 hours before handing can help to polish, eliminate basic errors and create an impression that sometimes CPs are even better than they are. Okay, it can make up for less information if it reads well. Okay, and it reads coherently and logically, and it's enjoyable to read. And then more basically, check grammar, punctuation, and spelling. Use a UK spell checker. And again, have somebody, your kind of biblio specialist, to check the referencing. Okay, check, should this be a tal? Should this not be a tal? Have we written all of the authors' names the first time, and now we're using a tal from here on out? Do we have page numbers for these quotes, for example? Are we referencing the survey respondents to the CCBS survey 2020? Again, it's basic, but it all helps to create an impression of professionalism and having finished something, that something is a finished product. So as I said before, this is what we're looking for in the fourth draft. It's a work in progress, but in generally speaking, the teams are getting there more and more with every draft. So we want flowing, coherent, and compelling narratives. So we want to feel like a story is being told, that the writer knows where they're going, what story they're trying to tell, and they're in charge, they're in control. They know what's coming up in the next paragraph. They're showing an example because they know later on in the section that example will be important. They'll return to it and they'll add a new level of complexity or detail to it. Similarly, if somebody says later, in contrast to what we said earlier in the section, when we said that leaders in country X were autocratic, our survey data now actually says something different. Our survey data now seems to suggest a flatter hierarchical structure and a greater degree of employee autonomy. What that does is it shows the author that you're aware what's in the beginning of your section. You know what you said, and you know how the information you're citing now relates to that, contradicts that, critiques that, supports it, etc. Again, tone, right for a broad readership, well structured. I'll show you that in the next slide. Please include native terms and expressions. So I've said this quite a lot to teams recently. Sometimes teams do it in certain sections, particularly the introduction, and then they abandon it throughout the rest of the CP. As I said earlier, the chapters are standardized in a sense, so one of the key ways in which each country will distinguish itself from the next in the final product is through the use of native terms and expressions. It helps to create kind of a unique local flavor. It helps to kind of enrich the sections. And it's something that readers can learn from. They can learn about different languages, albeit in a basic sense, through a shared knowledge of leadership. It's nice and it provides a window on the country that you're investigating, which is exactly what we're looking for. Again, make sure it's proofread as much as possible. And finally, and I'll return to this later, we need you to effectively synthesize the sources and data. Okay, it's all about synthesis. And synthesis, just to reiterate again, is just about bringing different elements together in order to tell a story. Exactly like if you're baking a cake or doing any cooking. It's not just made of one ingredient, okay? You have a final product that you're trying to achieve, but you're bringing in different elements that all help to tell that story, okay? Academic literature, survey data, interviewee data, local bestseller data, YouTube video reviews data, all of them can be used to illustrate, to support, to critique, to validate the discussions that you make. The challenge for you guys is to tell that in a flowing narrative that uses these different components to tell a coherent, logical story. It's hard, but that's why you've got quite a few opportunities with these drafts to practice it, get feedback on it, and keep working on it. Paragraph structure is still incredibly important. So remember, although for all the sections, formatting wise, we just want them to look like one big gigantic paragraph, which isn't how it always is in other academic essays you write, but we shouldn't have any spaces between separate paragraphs. It should all be part of one big paragraph. But nevertheless, you can create different paragraphs within that because of how you structure them. So each paragraph should start with a key point or a subtopic, okay? This is what this is about. We're going to talk about decision making and how this relates to hierarchy. That's your subtopic. That's the first point, okay? That's the topic sentence. So after that, you want to clearly develop by moving from the general to becoming more and more specific. So you then want to go on and illustrate that more. What does decision making look like in the Bahamas, for example? Can we cite some examples? Can we cite some academic literature that talks about the different types of decision making there are? Then we want to go more specific yet still. Do we have any good survey data, interviewee data that really shows a nice concrete example of how one specific organization or leader exercised decision making, either by involving their team or by making decisions in isolation in a more top-down type approach? And ultimately, at the end of a paragraph, you want to have some kind of concluding sentence. And that can be as simple as explaining, summarizing, clarifying. What does this tell us then about decision making in Malta or UK or Germany? What does what we've just told you in this paragraph, how does it add to the story that we're telling? And then you move on and talk about the next component. Now we're going to look at how first names and surnames, we're going to look at the degree of distance that there is between employers and employees in organizations and see how that's related to hierarchy in the country. You've moved on to something else, a new topic. And again, I'll just pause here on the screen because people will have time to pause this when they're watching at home. But you guys can also read this just now for yourselves. Start with a topic sentence. What are you talking about in this specific paragraph? First general point, should expand upon it a little bit, should add an extra level of detail. Then you might want to have a specific example from literature, from your survey, from an interviewee. Then you might have an additional point. So perhaps the additional point for most of your CPs could be, this used to be the form of leadership that prevailed in Papua New Guinea. But in recent years, due to economic shifts and other trends, globalization, internationalization, transnational corporations coming into the country, there's been some shifts. And then the next point would illustrate that. How does that look like? Well, specifically, organizations have become less hierarchical, less autocratic because of more Western influence, for example. And then a conclusion. What do we take from that, therefore? Is this now the way things are, or are there also other things that are going on in Papua New Guinean leadership? Okay, what does this tell us about hierarchy in the country then? That's your concluding sentence. Then you're moving on to something else, a new topic sentence, and so on and so forth. Now, there are easy ways and easy methods and tools, writing tools, that you can use to help structure your CP and create a narrative flow. So the ideal would be that you know exactly where you're going, you know the story you're telling because you're the storyteller. But if that's not the case, and you're not always sure, because sometimes you're having to write these CPs without having all the info, right? You're still waiting on survey data, you're still waiting on interviewee data. So sometimes you need to perform structure. And what I mean by that is that sometimes you need to rely on technique, on writing technique, to create structure, even if you don't feel it in your own head. So you can use different strategies to do so. So one is compare and contrast ideas. So you could state a point and then say, conversely, something else is the case. Or you could say, in comparison to this, or by comparison to this, something else is going on. So again, you're setting up a nice point of comparison between two things. That helps to link them together. Next could be just a simple illustration. An example of this is, now so many of you will have seen in your CPs in the third draft, me saying, please provide a concrete illustrative example of this. So that's what I mean by illustrate. Show the reader, what does this actually look like? I know I've just told you, but now I want to show you what it looks like. And in showing, you'll feel like you're there in the room. You'll be like, I get some insight into what it's like to be in a Nicaraguan organization. That's interesting. That's leaders go and do karaoke with their employees afterwards. That's cool. That gives me some insight into how trust, rapport, and an empathic understanding is established in that country through this specific practice. It's interesting. Often it's specific to your country. It's localized knowledge, exactly what we're looking for. Give further examples or explanation. You can use simple phrases like, in other words. So sometimes that just clarifies, what does this mean? And you're telling the reader, remember, you're writing for someone who will read this. In other words, what this means is, that is to say, these are all expressions you can use to serve that function. Emphasize or expand ideas. So sometimes you can say, this is important because it helps to show how leadership styles and practices have changed in recent years. This is important because it shows, despite what the survey respondents say, these statistics show that gender inequality is still a massive problem in Belgian organizations. Okay. You can also establish chronology. So sometimes I'll say this to teams very often when they're talking about colonial pasts or post-Soviet or Soviet history. Very often they're painting a chronology. Make sure that you tell that in a logical way. So you want to start by talking about the colonial past, then you want to talk about more recent developments. Usually that means you don't want to then return in the same introduction to then talk about the colonial past again. So establish chronology. What did leadership styles used to be like in UK, in Malta, in Bangladesh? How have they changed in the last 10, 20, 30 years, for example? So keep in mind also when you cite references, if those references are 10, 20, 30 years old and you're establishing chronology, then again think, we're trying to tell a story here that gender inequality has become prominent in recent years, but our reference is 30 years old. That kind of messes with the chronology. So again, you want to find some new references that help establish that chronology. So then you could say, this movement started 30 years ago, and these academics say that this is still the case now. This is carried through, etc. You can also rank ideas by importance. So you could say there are 3 things that are really important to understand how empathic understanding works in French organizations. You could say, above all, or the most important of these, is the concept of savoir-faire, or whatever. Yeah, the only French I know, probably. So you're establishing a degree of importance and significance, and you're discussing them and listing them in the order of that significance. Next, and some teams are doing this well already, enumerate. So you could say there are 3 things that are crucial to understanding how hierarchy functions in Qatar and Saudi Arabia. Firstly is the importance of Islamic values, customs, and so forth. Secondly is the extent of EU migrant workers who are working in the country, for example. So again, you're establishing numbers, and that helps to order your discussions, it helps to make them logical, and it helps to make each point follow on from the next. And again, it's very important, summarize and conclude. What this indicates ultimately is that this is the style of leadership that dominates in the country. What this indicates ultimately is that it's difficult to pin down regional differences in UK leadership styles and practices. Okay, so find ways of summarizing, concluding, tying a bow in a section, as I like to say, and then you can move on to something else. And it's particularly valuable to do that at the end of a section. Remember, at the end of a section, just like the end of a TV show or an advert break, you want to have something that ends on an impactful, satisfying close. Nothing worse than watching a show that ends after 6 series and you go, ugh, that's how they're ending? I've got to wait a year to watch that? It's exactly the same with a chapter. Don't end in a kind of unsatisfying, bland way. Summarize, conclude. What have we shown you in this section? What can we now take away from this that tells us how Bangladeshi population characterize leaders? Here are some examples from the downloads folder on OneDrive, again, of transitional phrases that you can use in order to freshen up some of the writing in the CP. Conversely, otherwise, however, rather, nonetheless, notwithstanding, in light of this, not to mention, blah, blah, blah. So many examples there. Have a look at these and look for ways in which you can use them in your CP to keep things fresh. So try and not use the same sort of phrases over and over. Find different ways of making things feel fresh, okay? So now at this stage, I'm going to move on to talk about some best practice examples. I'll reiterate what I said at the beginning of the video, which is that I need to show concrete examples in order to illustrate broader, more general points that people are doing well, and also things that people need to improve on. I'm not doing it to shame individual teams. I need to have concrete examples to show on the screen that we can all learn from. Because the reality is, if 1 or 2 teams are doing it, there's probably 12 or 13 teams that are doing certain problems over and over, okay? So I'm trying not to do it in a way which is mean or shaming anybody, but I'm using these in the spirit of the whole course, which is that ultimately we're all trying to write a book together, and the quality of the book, as I say, rises and falls on the quality of the individual chapters. So I've mentioned this to teams as well in team talks, and I've recommended that they go and have a look at other folders, again, to try and learn from what other teams are doing well, so they can mimic that, use that, and apply that structurally or content-wise to their own CPs. So I'm just going to show a couple of things that teams did well. Again, it's more about what was done well as opposed to what teams did well. Similarly, when I show what needs to be improved on, It's more about the content than the team that did it. So keep in mind, that's the spirit I'm coming from. So I'm going to mention Norway again. So I actually used this in the first draft, but I still want to use it as a nice example of how people included native terms and also included a little bit, and the crucial bit here is a little bit of playfulness, but yet still maintained the required tone for a management book. And I've said in the first CP clinic why I liked it, and I'll reiterate that, is because it said something through a singular example. It said something more about Norwegian culture and about potentially the psychology of the Norwegian people, which ultimately ties into things that Team Norway go on to talk about later in the CP. Not necessarily directly, but as a reader, you go, that says something about Norwegian people that they do that. Just like the fact that Scottish people drink an insane amount of whiskey says something about Scottish people, and that they might not let people in fancy restaurants put ice in certain whiskies. That says something about the Scottish national character. That's what I liked about this particular example. But again, you can't just look at this and then copy and apply it. Each case is different. The reason why I'm using it is because I'm trying to say, are there examples in the countries that you're investigating that say something more in a single example that speak to the national character of a country? And potentially how that national character impacts on their leadership style. Okay, so that's why I'm highlighting this again, and also the use of native terms. Now I'm mentioning this example here. Sorry, I skipped by mistake. I'm going back to it. I mention this example because it's also good because it's well written, but also because it was in response to feedback from a previous draft. And in the previous feedback on the earlier draft, they had written something and then not explained it. And in that draft, I said, try and provide an example and say a little bit more about this. So the whole sentence, a possible cause for this phenomenon could be that for years, German men held a more dominant role in society than their female counterparts. They have a reference, very good. And I think at the time, that was it. And then I asked, give some more examples. So they say, why does that matter? And then they have in masculine orientated societies, there's often an emphasis on performance and competition. These factors generally bring the so-called, I can't read it, my German's terrible, male aggression to the surface, thereby further increasing the gender gap. So there's a couple of things I like there. A, they've responded well to the feedback, and B, they've tried to explain something further that was only mentioned partially before. They've also used a native term, so they've used German, and they've put it in brackets, the English expression, again, to try and say something about how this native term captures the spirit of how organizations are run, and the fact that performance and competition are particularly masculine qualities, not in an essential sense that they belong to men, but that they've been characterized with masculinity for so long. It says something about gender inequality, how it functions. It says something about what the basis for hierarchy is. There's good detail, there's a couple of references, and there's a native term and an explanation. Very good, exactly what we're looking for. So when you see me saying in your CPs, cite an example, give me more detail what this means. That's the kind of example you could use. It's specific and it's quintessentially German. So what do we have here? I'm using an example of good contextual information about bestseller author, because quite a lot of the feedback on this and the YouTube reviews, as you'll see in a moment, I kept saying to teams, we need a little bit more background information about the author of the book. Okay, so some context. Who are they? What is their professional background? Have they held any prominent roles as a business leader or an academic or a CEO, for example, in an organization, or perhaps they held office politically in the country that you're studying? It doesn't have to be huge, but just some detail that helps gain insight into who this person is and why they might have a legitimate opinion about leadership in the country through their book. Okay. So again, this also relates to the YouTube videos that I'll talk about in a little bit. So I'm using this example here as a good example of what I'm calling narrative flow and a logically structured paragraph. So this is from the empathy section. So to read, the Germans are classified as a low context culture. So again, what's good here is that before your brain goes, what's low context? They already move on to this implies, so they're explaining that the communication between managers and their employees is explicit and literal without room for misinterpretation. Building private relationships are not a priority here, while getting the job done is. Then they have a reference. In German business culture, they desire independence and tend to shy away from group cohesiveness or excessive levels of compassion. Then we have some causality here. What does this lead to? Well, the next sentence tells us this causes Germans to build interpersonal relationships more slowly than other countries. Reference, full stop. So you can see there, the paragraph, it sets up something, it gives an explanation of it, it then adds an additional example, it then provides a more concrete specific example, and it establishes cause and effect at the end. What is the consequence of what we just said? Well, it leads to this, and it's in the realms of talking about empathy. So it's on point and it's related to the content we're looking at in that section. Here's an example of leadership being mentioned in the introduction. So I'm just picking this one, and I'm not saying it's exactly perfect because I think they might go on a little bit too much and give too much detail even. You don't want to give away too much and show too much about leadership in the introduction. That's what the characterized leaders section is for, the very next section after the introduction. But what they do well is they make the end of the introduction leadership orientated. So many of the teams will recognize this who are on the either watching live tonight or watching later. There's so many feedback in the introductions where I say you guys still need to have a transition to talking about leadership. So again, have a look at this in your own time. I'm not saying it's perfect, it's perhaps a little bit too detailed, but nevertheless, by the end of this section, by the end of the introduction, no one is under any illusions what the chapter is about. Everyone will know that it is about leadership in Germany. Okay? And so many of the introductions, when they end, that isn't clear. It's not explicit that you're reading a book about leadership. At this stage, coming up for fourth draft, that needs to be resolved. Need to make it leadership focused. Okay? Inclusion of native terms and expressions. I've mentioned this before. It's really good. Please try and use it in different sections of your CP. It helps to make it specific, and I think it helps gain insight into a national culture, which is exactly what we're looking for, and more specifically, the way in which that culture is reflected in organizations. So this is quite a naughty one. So anyone who's prudish, I apologize, but this says an expression that really captures how leaders are perceived in France. Again, I don't speak French, so I apologize. Posers about sur la table, which literally translate as putting your penis on the table. So again, it's a specific expression. It's written in French. It's translated in English. But more importantly, already your imagination starts to think, that says something perhaps about what leadership might be like. It already sets up maybe a discussion to come back to later, that there might be a strong kind of over hyper masculine component to leadership in the country. So in the hierarchy section, perhaps they'll come back to explore that in more detail. How does that play out in practice? But again, native terms, very good. Another good example, this is from Team Qatar. So Team Qatar actually did this very well. They had several sections that directly used native terms and expressions, and also had the English translation in brackets. And again, it just helps to make it feel specific. You'll probably see this now. Your eye is immediately drawn to those native terms. They stand out. Okay, they look rich, they stand out, and the reader learns something from seeing that. Okay, you might not understand even how to read it. I don't understand how to read the language, but you see it and you think, that's quite cool. Okay, it feels specific and it feels local. So we want to see examples like that in everybody's CP. This is a good example, pointing forward a little bit, of how you synthesize survey and interview data. So off the top of my head, I think this is St. Martin, I think, who use Genus. Perhaps you can nod somewhere on the screen, even if I can't see you. I think it's St. Martin. And they start a sentence by saying, according to Genus 2020, because it's from an interview they conducted, and the survey respondents. So they've already included some survey respondents. The way a boss is addressed is not important as long as there is sufficient respect among the staff and the leaders. On the other hand, that's a nice way of setting up and linking together sentences, but setting up, we're going to talk about something differently now that disagrees with this. They then quote another interviewee. Artson states that it's very common to address the leader by his or her last name. Also good there, gender neutral language, his or her, out of respect for their position, even when they are familiar. And then again, they use another transitional phrase, furthermore, which suggests they're moving on to talk about something else. But what you'll see there is it creates a sense of flow. It starts to feel like music and not like clunky, jarring, separate sentences. Again, another nice example, again, I think, again, from St. Martin. So in purple, they say, as Janus notes, then they have a direct quote, it is important that the staff feels comfortable and knows that we are there to help each other. So again, what are we looking for there? Ideally, we want either an example or some support from academic research, or in this instance, from survey data. All the executives in the CCBS survey confirm that a manager should actively spend time on the personal well-being of the team members. Now, some teams might just leave it there, job done. It's not the job done. You then need to tell me, what does that mean? What does it suggest? What can we conclude from that? So they do that. This implies that informal communication is widely used in St. Martin and that the hierarchical gap is not as wide as it is in some other countries. So again, it's specific, they're summing up, they're concluding, and they're linking it back to hierarchy. This is what it tells us. Yeah, really good example. This is exactly what we want you guys to all be doing as we move forward. So I use Qatar, this example, I believe, in the first draft. And again, it's just a nice way of effectively structuring a discussion. So they start, and again, they get right to the point, which is good. To understand hierarchy in Qatar, first, one has to be aware that status, respect, and age play key roles in how leaders in Qatari make their decisions. Secondly, understanding the different levels of social status is key to this process. Then what's good? They explain it more detail. Social status is structured as follows. Okay, and they then go on to clarify what the hierarchy is. So literally, the hierarchy, depending on which group you belong to. Once the differences between these 5 groups is understood, understanding how one does business will be a lot less complex. Okay, now I think at that point they need to go on by just showing it rather than talking about how it's complex. Show, tell us. Okay. So show, how can we understand that? What does it tell us? How does this actually play out in a real organization? Is there any examples from Qatari researchers that illustrate the ways in which people have different status in an organization based on belonging to one of those categories above? But nevertheless, the numbering is good. Good job, guys. So, effective explanation. This is from Team Zimbabwe. Hello, Team Zimbabwe. I saw you join us a bit later, Pastor. Thank you for joining. Hope you're well. It says, therefore, they are likely to impose initiatives and ideas upon their subordinates as opposed to inspiring their followers to work towards goals, achievements, and self-realization. And why I like that is because it clarifies and sums up the sentence that comes before. The sentence that comes before is Zimbabwean leaders are also autocratic rather than democratic. Now, what I tended to see in a lot of other CPs sometimes was teams would just leave it there. They would say leaders in country X are transformational rather than transactional. Then they would move on to talk about something else. That's not enough. You need to show some examples of what that means. They do that well here. Therefore, and then they show what does that mean in practice? What does that look like if you're actually working here? Feels specific, feels local. To explain, this is another good explaining sentence from Qatar. So they have, I used this in the first draft as well. So here they put the attitudes and behaviours are very remarkable associated with leadership in Qatar. To explain, the Qataris have high moral values based on Islamic principles and ideals such as honesty, modesty, solidarity, courtesy, consultation, obedience to seniors, and trusting others. But just the words to explain, not perfect, but it's good. They're trying to link sentences together. This is what that means. It could have said, in other words, that is to say, or any other phrase like that. What is good about this? Well, it doesn't relate to any of my comments. That's why the green arrow is on the side. So it's a separate thing. And what is good about this? Well, once again, they have a clarifying sentence. So they say Hofstede's view is supported by Gillian, Warner, Soderholm. So they're synthesizing, they're linking together research with Hofstede's view that they've expressed earlier in the section, and then they're showing what they've argued, who argued that Scandinavian societies appear to be intrinsically egalitarian. Again, some teams might leave it there, but they don't. They say this means they value low power distance, directness, consensus in decision making, and the promotion of gender equality. Excellent. It explains it, it clarifies, it sums up. And as you're probably reading that, you're thinking, great, I'm ready to hear about the next point. And they do. They move on to talk about something else here. They talk about the study in more depth and introduce an additional element. Again, good stuff. And it looks simple when you see it like that. And I understand it's not. I understand it can be difficult, but hopefully in showing these, you can see that I'm not holding some abstract idea of perfection in my head and enjoying telling teams that I don't think they're getting there. There are real examples I can point to of teams that have worked on it, received feedback, and improved it, and I can show you and say this is kind of what we're trying to aim for. Try and kind of get closer to this. So just like with the same spirit that I showed the previous drafts, you may have saw your country in there, you may have not saw your country in there. Just because you didn't see your country in the best practice examples didn't mean that you didn't do lots of things well. I had to select from somewhere, and we don't have all the time in the world, so I had to find some, and I did, to tell the story I wanted to tell. Exactly the same with this section, okay? So if you see your teams come up in here, doesn't mean that everything you did was bad, obviously. Just means that there were specific examples of broader issues that lots of teams followed. Otherwise, I wouldn't bring them up, because then I would just talk to you individually in your team talks. So I'm using singular examples because they happened more than once. So the first thing is a general comment. Please resolve delete comments from previous drafts. Sorry, Team Turkey, I know you saw this in my feedback. Wasn't necessarily this comment from Xander or myself. It was the one above from me that related to a previous draft, and it didn't really need to be there anymore. So please, when you hand in a new draft, make sure that it eliminates any comments that no longer relate to the chapter anymore. Next is a common problem, and I really want to emphasize this. So many teams still need to try and make their introduction at the end a little bit more leadership orientated. Okay, so I'm using this example here of perhaps from Papua New Guinea, which is perhaps a little underdeveloped. So they've tried to do it for sure. They've introduced this idea of a one-talk system in terms of social obligations, values being a big part of culture in the country. And then they put the way you can look at the Papua New Guineans one-talk system can vary by naming the difference between the big man and big shot leadership styles. And what I said to those guys, I think it still needs a little bit more work. So I think they need one or two sentences either before that or something after that that explain a little bit what big man and big shot leadership styles are, and that also link it more specifically back to how that comes out of the one-talk system. And again, although that's a specific example, in general, most teams need to link the demographic stuff, the cultural stuff, the values, the religious stuff, the socio-demographic stuff, colonial, post-Soviet stuff, to how does that impact on leadership. So the first 3/4 of your introduction are setting up these things: demographics, geographics, geopolitics, history, religion. By the end, you need to just say a little bit about how these may have or do impact on the leadership styles that are adopted in that country. So, for example, if you think of France, in that quote about putting the dick on the table or whatever, is there something from French culture, values, and history that leads to that sort of expression and masculine-orientated leadership style? The answer would be yes. And in the very end of the introduction, you want to just try and introduce and make a bit of a link between this background, between that history, between these values, and how that might play out in a leadership context. Don't say too much, because that's what you do in the very next section. You hit the ground running and you start discussing that in the characterize leader section. And again, I mentioned France here because they have an example that they've tried to do quite well. So they're talking about France being renowned for some incredible famous historical leaders, Napoleon Bonaparte, for example, Charles de Gaulle. And then they kind of drift at that point and talk about Coco Chanel and Christian Dior. Not because those two aren't of value. They're renowned figures also, but it then starts to tell a different story, I think, that kind of drifts away. Fashion leaders probably aren't as, there's probably not as strong a link between fashion leaders as there is between political leaders and business leaders. Then they return to the business leaders again, and they try a playful sentence, which in some contexts I might like, but I feel like they needed to make the point stronger. So they put, it's safe to say that strong leadership never goes out of style in France. But when you say strong leadership, you would tend to think that would follow Napoleon and Charles de Gaulle rather than Coco Chanel and Christian Dior. So maybe just by taking some things out, rearranging things, you can create that transition that I keep telling teams to try and do. But it's an ongoing process. Everyone's still trying to find that balance. But if your team doesn't have it already, you need to try and do it. Okay. Again, I mentioned this earlier, and I've almost mentioned this almost in every single feedback for the YouTube review section. But please, if you have 2 or 3 videos or 2 videos, please make sure that the first sentence introduces the context of the video. Who is the person? What is their profession and background? And also, what is the context for the video? Is it an interview, for example? Is it a conference, for example? Is it a symposium? Is it an international leadership conference? Is it a seminar? Are they speaking to university students, and so on and so forth? Okay, so provide context for each one. Then when you move on to the next video, again, introduce the next video, introduce the next author, and explain what the context of the video is. And same again, I've just mentioned this for Team Norway this time, perhaps provide a little more context for these YouTube videos. So lots of teams will have seen that. So that's what I'm referring to, okay? Conferences, symposiums, interviews, etc. That might impact on the sorts of things that are talked about, for example. Here's an example of where I think things are just not explained in enough detail, and interesting points are just left cut off before people move on to talk about other things. So this is an example from Team Zimbabwe, and they say culture and leadership are intertwined in the country. Thus, Zimbabwean leaders are conscious of the broad diversity of tribes, traditions, customs, and languages. First thing I read when I see that sentence, I go, yeah, great, tell me about it and show me some examples. But they don't. They move on to talk about something else. That happens a lot across multiple CPs. So when you see me say more detail, explain it, or this seems like a good point, expand upon it. That's what I mean. Doesn't mean that you need to talk about it necessarily for 50 sentences. It just means you need to summarize, clarify, illustrate, and show an example of what you're talking. Otherwise, as I said earlier, it's just in the reader's imagination. They're doing the work to piece it together. This next sort of discussion is, I just want to reference that you can't go too many sentences in big blocks of sentences like this without referencing somebody. So if you have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 sentences or so like this without being attached to a reference, that's not what we want to see. So you need to have a reference every 2 or 3 sentences or so. Unless it's clear, if you're talking about a singular paper in detail and are writing in such a way that it's clear that you're still talking about that paper, then it might be okay. But if a discussion goes on for 5 or 6 paragraphs and doesn't refer back to the reference, then it becomes unclear where you're getting your information from. Then it can become problematic. So try and not leave too much space. Okay, so this is another example of that. So for example, right from, you see above the purple, there's a reference von Bose, 2014. Then there's a really long discussion that goes all the way down to Wilksman et al. 2009. It's unclear at that point what reference is being talked about anymore. Where is that information coming from? Okay, so even if they think, well, it's still Wilksman et al., for example, just have another reference to that somewhere in the middle that makes it clear that the information you're citing there still relates to that. This is an example from Papua New Guinea. We talked about this in the team talks, I believe. Again, it's just too long and too big without being referenced to a specific reference. So again, you shouldn't see something this long. Even if you feel like it's clear that it relates to, you need to have In a paragraph the size of this, you would need to have at least 3 or 4 references, even if they're all the same. And if they're all the same, then you maybe shouldn't have a section like this that is so long that only refers to one reference. You should look to introduce other references to have different voices, different perspectives. And again, I'm using this as an example of when I keep saying use concrete examples. So now, particularly from the interviewees and your survey respondents, use examples to illustrate things. So this is the very last sentences from Norway's chapter. They have, with mutual respect for one another, Norwegian leaders operate, as a spelling mistake there, with an informal approach, communicate directly, and are accessible. They have the power to escalate when required and will demonstrate high levels of empathy in situations where it is especially needed. All I want to see there is a little bit of an example. So, for example, then perhaps show what are the different elements, what are the different scenarios under which they will escalate power when required, or when they will demonstrate high levels of empathy. Just show an example that helps to illustrate a real leader working through that dilemma and striking that balance in an organization. Here, use examples again to illustrate actual leadership practices. So this is from Team Peru. It says, in Peruvian culture, being a good communicator and being able to demonstrate partnership orientation is associated with authority and power. So here I said, well, try and explain what partnership orientation is. So explain it. So you can say, in other words, or an example of partnership orientation is X or Y. And then again, try and show an example from the interview or survey data that illustrates this. Okay, what is an example of a Peruvian leader being a good communicator? Okay, while still displaying their authority and power. Show an example, clarify, sum up. So this is another example from Team Peru. So here it says, this does not mean, so I think this is the hierarchy section, and they're talking about the nature of hierarchy in organizations. And they introduce a good clarification. So they say, this does not mean to say that subordinates do not have any influence in the decision-making process. So again, I go, okay, good. So that's good. I'm like, great. So you're introducing a counter argument here. But the problem is that they don't go on to cite an example. So what I want to see right after that is an example of how some subordinates and employees are involved in the decision-making process. You could then add an additional layer of detail and complexity. What are the conditions under which they are part of the decision-making process? What kinds of decisions are they not? When is the hierarchy very clear? When is the hierarchy more flat, for example? Okay, so I'm just going to take a very short pause there just to check if there is anything. Okay, from the chat, everything's cool. Everybody's here. Nice. So, moving forward. Yes, this is another big point. And again, lots of teams will have had examples of me highlighting sections saying, I'm not quite sure that works here, guys. Maybe that should be in your characterized leader section or your empathy section rather than your hierarchy section, for example. So, what is the example here? So, yeah, maybe this one doesn't match. Maybe this is a mistake on my part. Particularly noticeable in terms of the communication between supporters and leaders. Yeah, maybe that's just a mistake. I can't see what section it's from to give more clarification. Maybe Team Germany knows, so we'll just ignore that one. Tone, yes, sorry, Team UK. I love my homeland, but this is maybe an example of where the playful tone was just a little bit too much. So they've got, in the end of the introduction, to gain a smashing insight into British leadership, just a little bit too comical, a little bit too light and too informal for the management book. You would see it more in kind of a blog or a kind of tourist journalism piece. So again, keep that tone, keep it formal. It's good to have a playful example like we saw with the French earlier, but ideally it should say something and give greater insight into a national culture or the values in a culture, for example. This is about style guide issues. So there's still some issues with teams using single quotation marks for quotes. So as per style guide, it should be double quotation marks. Okay, so double quotation marks for each quote rather than single, please. This is an example of narrative flow and paragraph structure. So I just want to highlight, and there's also another thing going on here that I want to emphasize. So it's St. Martin, and they say Daniela Jeffrey stated in her paper, Culture, Identity and Nationality, since our nationality is not that of our country, more than anyone else, we have to cling to our culture in order to identify ourselves. And the context for this discussion is there's a high level of immigration in the country, and there'd be more of a movement towards preserving St. Martin culture, essentially. Okay, so that was the context for that quote. And then immediately it's preceded by another direct quote. But that other direct quote doesn't follow on from that previous point. It starts a new point. It says, according to Artson, the people of St. Martin sought the easier way out and started to feel comfortable with a job and working for others. So it introduces a different discussion. And that's not good. You want to have more of a link between them or signal that you're moving on. And also, it's not great to have two quotes back to back right next to each other. So ideally, you don't want to have two quotes following each other in a sentence. Try and use them sparingly and use them impactfully. This was just another example, I believe, from Team Peru, and I talked about this in the team talk, is just to kind of create more of a narrative flow between certain points. So they say these values are translated in words such as El Patron, and I was saying I would have liked to seen an English translation there for that, where the owner of the company treats their employees as their extended family. What I'd like to see after that is an example. Because how leaders in Peru treat their employees as extended family might be different from how they do that in Japan, Papua New Guinea, Sri Lanka, UK, Germany, Malta, etc. What makes this local is a good example. How does a kind of general Peruvian leader treat their employees as extended family? Do they invite them around for barbecues? Do they invite them round to their children's birthday party, for example? Do they go to karaoke bars together? So these examples are what make them specific and what gain us insight into the local culture. So rather than moving on to the next point, which is talking about self-direction, expand, explain, and keep introducing that narrative flow. This is just an issue of readability and clarity, but it also links back to what I said earlier about not writing too academically at times. So not writing in a way that's too complicated and it becomes ambiguous or unclear what you're saying. So they have Papua New Guinea can be typified as a country with an extent of social differentiation across very small areas, and even with such a late and limited contact with the global economy and society, that cultural differences retain extraordinary vitality. So a couple of things there. You get a bit tired reading it because it's quite long. It's quite wordy. There's no punctuation in it. And also it's just a little bit complicated in relation to what comes after. You read it and then you kind of have to look back at it again and think, okay, what are they saying? And again, at that point, it's the reader who's doing the explaining. They're having to put the pieces together. You don't want to have the reader do that work. You want to clarify and explain. So they could have said after this, in other words, or what we mean by this is that, and then a concrete example could have clarified for the reader what is meant. This is again just an issue of readability and clarity, some of which could be eliminated in proofreading and reading out loud. So this example from a sentence from Team France says, this contrast exists because France conducts contrasting features and values, since paradox remains a huge concept. So it happens now and again, but as I said, I just had no idea what it meant at that moment. Again, try and think of me as a real talking person when I make these comments. I usually don't mean anything in a bad way. It looks a bit cold sometimes in writing, but that would be the context. If I spoke to you face to face, I would go, guys, I've just no idea what that means. Explain, unpack. And usually when you ask someone to explain what they mean, they explain it in a much more clearer, straightforward and understandable way than is somehow expressed in writing. So try and do that work for yourself. Read it out loud. Have someone else read it. And if they go, I have no idea what that means, simplify it, explain. And it probably means it will be better as a result. This is now finally a good example of ensuring content matches the requirements of the section. So this is quite a big section here. I need to look at it a little bit to try and think where it comes from. Perhaps it's Sri Lanka, but I can't be sure. But yeah, all of this section in purple is in the characterized leader section, I believe. And it immediately starts talking about organizational structure. it starts talking about let's have a look. There's quite a lot here. Status, micro-nationalist groups wanted to show that they could achieve what the government did not offer. This probably made the takeover of foreign plantations and businesses a symbolic expression of independence. Magamba, Amanko, and Haynes explain that directors undertake a variety of functions depending on their role and size or type of the company. For a small company, the director truly manages the company. So there's a lot going on there in that sentence. And again, in the characterized leaders section, once you start talking about size of structure, the size and structure of companies, who manages the company and so forth, different organizational structures and management structures, it should probably be in the hierarchy section. Equally, you want to make sure that the content you're talking about, particularly if it goes on too much about governmental stuff, about geopolitics, about conflict in a country, and too much on colonialism in a country. Again, I'm not a mean guy. These things mean a lot to me personally, but in a leadership and management book, we can't talk in great detail about every single thing that's went on in a country historically, because we would never be able to say anything about leadership, because all countries, some more than others, are characterized by lots of trauma and violence and occupation and so forth. So again, it's fine to touch upon that to some extent, as long as it's in the context of making a point about leadership. If it doesn't do that over 2-3 sentences, it means it can probably come out. So make sure the content matches what the section is about, is what I'm trying to say there. Again, this is from Papua New Guinea, and I think once again it's in the characterized leaders section. And this whole section in purple begins: conflict communication concerning hierarchy is influenced by numerous situational features in Papua New Guinea. One feature is internal or domestic immigration, people moving. Transition led to competition among immigrants and between immigrants and host citizens for scarce resources and job opportunities. Citizens blame external immigrants for benefiting from resources that citizens claim are their rights. As you can see, it doesn't really relate to leadership whatsoever. Not to say it's not a real problem in countries or that it's not an issue. Of course it is, but it doesn't relate to leadership styles and practices. So it's too much information about content that isn't appropriate for that section, unfortunately. So this is at the very end of the empathy section, again from Papua New Guinea, making no judgments about the team as a whole. Just using this as an example. So many teams did this, particularly in the empathy section. Keep in mind the empathy section is the final section in the book. So place real good emphasis on how it ends. You want your chapter to end strongly. So you want to make sure that the content you mention, of course, links to empathy. So at the end here, we have, in addition, employees expect their leaders to be able to make concrete decisions and not hesitate too much to avoid confusion. Also have the opportunity to think visionarily, and thus also give employees the opportunities to show themselves and to show what they are capable of to develop themselves. Now, maybe a tiny bit at the end that starts to hint towards the fact that that might link to empathy, but it's not clear, and certainly the first half of the 2-3 sentences don't link. So again, you need to make sure as you go along that the content links to the requirements of the section. Okay, and obviously you have material in textbook. You have Xander's lecture from a while ago now that explained what should be in each section. You also have our feedback now up to third drafts that also highlight and say what's appropriate for where. Again, this is the end of the introduction to Zimbabwe's CP, and it starts with: though life is full of challenges, with hard work and the support of the African concept of the extended family, along with Ubuntu, I am because you are, or a person is a person through other people. Most Zimbabweans can move from the bottom of Maslow's pyramid to the top. So again, this is the conclusion of the introduction, but by the end, it's not clear that what you're about to talk about is leadership necessarily. Also, a concept like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which I presume is what they're talking about here, is mentioned, but again, that doesn't really relate to leadership styles and practices, I have to say. And again, if you introduce something like Maslow's pyramid, it just seems out of place in this context. So end the introduction in a way that sets up for the reader that clearly the chapter is about leadership. This is an example from Team Peru. Again, I think this is from the hierarchy section, and it's talking about Peru being a centralized country and a third of the population living in the capital. and this is the kind of main hub and base for a lot of the business services and so forth. That doesn't really relate to how hierarchy is practiced within organizations. That's more about perhaps where the concentration of power is located in the country, I guess. That like London in the UK tends to be a power concentration economically and politically, but it doesn't tie into leadership practices and skills. So if you see comments like this from me and highlighting big sections, doesn't mean that you can lift it verbatim and shove it in another section. It means that you'll have to take out some elements and weave it together into a flowing narrative in the other section in a way that makes sense. Again, what we tend to see quite a fair bit, particularly in the empathy section, is people start to drift. So the empathy section usually starts quite specific, often with a definition, which you don't need to do. Get talking about empathy in your country immediately in the organizations. And what happens by the end, it often becomes less and less about empathy. So this is Bangladesh here. It says this leadership style is more about encouraging followers to question their way of doing things and become innovative rather than making them strictly follow instructions and continually request permission from their higher ups. It requires trust and respect from the leader to allow this leadership style to have a positive effect on the organizational performance. So although you might be able to twist it and bend it and link it back, it's by the end, it's not clear that it's really talking about empathy anymore. And again, it's the final concluding sentences of the CP. So you want it to be specific and you want it to be on point. Again, I've said that this is good, but there's just a little referencing point. So I chatted to the guys about this out loud, but again, this was quite common across other CPs. So keep in mind, if you are citing a paper which is written by 3 or more people, obviously if you keep citing the 3 names of people all the time, it's going to get repetitive, it's going to be annoying to read, and it's going to take up your word count unnecessarily. So what you do is the first time you cite a paper or anything that was written by 3 authors, you cite all of their names and then the year of publication. That means that they all individually get credit, because if you were one of those authors and you were always known as et al., and you were saying to your family, I promise I wrote that book, et al., that's me, I promise, that's me, you'd be a bit gutted that you weren't mentioned. So everybody gets their name mentioned once, and thereafter, to make it simpler and make it flow, you just put the name of the first author and et al. It's not always alphabetical who's the first author, it's a political thing. Often it's the most senior person or the person who wrote the most. So you list the first name as it's mentioned on the paper and then et al. Thereafter. So please do that if you haven't done already. Another point I want to make is that we need more specificity in the local bestseller section. Almost all teams got this message from me. So obviously this is something we need to do a little bit more with. Keep in mind, when I talk about more specificity and more detail, it doesn't just mean adding loads and loads of info to what you already have. Often it means starting again and just being much more specific and detailed with the information you mention. So you want to make sure that you choose the right book, of course, but you want to try and summarize the 3 or 4 main points from the book that say something distinctive about leadership styles and practices in the country you're investigating. Ideally from a business perspective, but if you can only get a political bestseller, try and see if there's any crossover between the political styles of leadership in a country, if they're autocratic, if they're transformational, if it's based on charismatic leadership or a visionary, for example. The likelihood is that some of that might also rub off on business leadership in the country. So again, try and summarize 3 or 4 points that say what the book is about, but more importantly, what the book tells us about either what leadership is in your country, what it has been historically, and what it should be or is becoming. And if you get good stuff there, remember, you're able to cite it in other elements of your CP as support. You can say this corresponds to what this local bestseller said, for example. Again, I'm not sure this is from Bangladesh this time. Exactly the same message. A little bit more detail. What 3 or 4 aspects are critical for Bangladeshi business leaders or would help someone understand how leadership functions in the country? That's what all of this is about, remember. Getting different voices to say different things. Now, at that point, or at this point rather, we're going to transition into the tip clip element. So as I said at the beginning, The tip clip this week is about the fourth draft and specifically about how to synthesize survey and interview data into your CPs, which we already want you to try and do for the fourth draft this Sunday, but you will be doing all the time moving forward. So with that in mind, I will now move on to show some concrete examples of what those sections should look like, essentially. So what the survey section should look like and so forth. Okay, so bear with me. So this comes from Team Bahamas, I believe. And if you look on the left-hand side, this is the survey results and what local respondents say section. So they introduce it by talking about the fact that the survey will introduce more knowledge and insight into leadership in the Bahamas. They talk about who the target group are, C-level executives and managers. And they then go on to talk about what the specific focus is of the survey: leadership style, leadership qualities, and gender equality. Now, they then say the most important findings that emerge from the survey are summarised below. So that's good. They're kind of setting up the discussion, what's to come. And what they do well is they then use enumeration to introduce the different main themes or findings that they think are significant. So they do that by saying the first interesting result is that most respondents agreed that a manager should actively spend time on the personal well-being of their team members. They then reference that to the CCBS survey 2020. And again, they then explain this confirms that Bahamians are relationship orientated, and then they go on to cite a quote from one of the open-ended answers, again from the CCBS survey, to expand, to illustrate, to give a little bit more detail. Then they use another transitional phrase to sum up and clarify what the cause of this is. Therefore, caring about employees and showing compassion towards them is a distinctive feature of Bahamian leadership. Great. Sums up, close. That's the first finding. That's the first theme discussed. How do they move on to the next theme? They do so through enumeration. Secondly, it is interesting to note that most respondents reported that management decisions cannot simply be changed, as well as the fact that employees are expected to follow established procedures. Again, they clarify, what does this mean? Well, they say this suggests, and they then go on to, I'll not read the whole thing because you'll be here all night, but you hopefully see what I mean. They then say this is supported by the fact, and again, they cite the survey. Just over half of the respondents said that employees are not allowed to bend the rules without asking. What did they do then? They cite a more specific example through a direct quote. As one respondent noted, then they directly quote and they provide a reference. Awesome. What you'll notice is sometimes they introduce an author's name specifically or a respondent's name specifically and also where they work. Other times they refer to them in an anonymized simply as a respondent. So at the end of your surveys, you'll be able to see how people want to have their name used and their information used, whether they want to be fully anonymized and just known as a respondent, or whether they're happy for you to include their name and their title. So you can see there, it's just over maybe a page long. They identify 3 or 4 themes, they reference it, they summarize, they quote kind of basic percentages, just over half, around a third, 2/3, etc. They show direct quotes from the survey in order to illustrate points, make them come to life, and they link together the different information. This is exactly what we are looking for in your survey data coming up. What do we have here? Here I want to show an example of the local leadership analysis section. So on the right-hand side, you can see how they go about writing about their audio interview with the particular scholar. So they talk about who they are, they give some context for who they work for, and they then go on to unpack some of the main points that they discuss in relation to Bahamas. So as you can see, they use a mixture of direct quotations. They also summarize. But as you can see in the middle of that page on the right-hand side, they say, for instance, Bahamians are used to following the rules and are rarely permitted to bend them. And they're referencing the CCBS survey here. They then go on to say, however, according to Monroe, there is a change in leadership and employee behaviour. The next sentence explains what this change is. The younger generation demands greater participation. In fact, millennials want leaders to move aside, and they have a direct quote. What that is a really good example of is synthesis. They are synthesizing interview data, survey data, bringing them together in order to tell a story and a logical flowing argument. So again, I would really recommend everyone checking out old versions of the CP to see how people do this and how they do it well. Okay, so similarly, we have another example here from Bahamas, again in relation to their cross-cultural trainer. So their YouTube, what will eventually be their YouTube interview. Again, they give context for who the person is and what their professional background and expertise is, how many years they have, a work experience in the Bahamas, for example. And again, they do a nice mixture of relating quotes and also linking to other data. So they'd use direct quotes, they summarize Ferguson's argument, for example, and they tell a nice story. And there's concrete examples in these stories, in these quotes, that can also be useful to use elsewhere in the CP. They don't just have to be contained to their individual sections, although that is where you will be writing about the majority of the information. But you can also use them elsewhere, of course. Okay, so this is another example. This comes from Team Nigeria, and this is from their particular survey section. Again, they have a nice introduction that introduces what the survey is and what it's going to provide insight into. At the very bottom, they have a quote from Apollo Goma, a CEO in Nigeria, who agreed to have their name, but not necessarily what company they worked for. And they have a direct quote from this person. Quite a lot of people don't practice what they, next page, preach. CCBS survey 2020. Then they have a traditional reference that they've mentioned in their CP. As aforementioned, Udegbe posits that love, trust and respect are what characterize Nigerian leadership. With this in mind, it is instructive to examine how our survey respondents discussed the health and well-being of their subordinates. Then they say, okay, what was it like then? So they use a nice transitional phrase. In this regard, the vast majority of the executives stated that a leader should actively dedicate time to the well-being of their subordinates. So you can see they're using that survey data, they're using basic numbers, yeah? So they're talking about 2/3 and so forth. And they're also then giving some summary. So they say it was also reported that leaders should also attempt to foster a sense of competition within teams so that their employees would seek to excel. They then move on by saying another interesting finding from the survey data is that more than 2/3 of the respondents assumed that their subordinates would not bend the rules without asking. What do you want to see at that point? Well, hopefully you guys should be very clear now. You want to see a direct quote that illustrates that. They link it to a specific person. I'm not going to read the name because my pronunciation is terrible, but they then give a direct quote from that person. And again, they have enumeration. Finally, one further interesting detail that emerged from the survey was the fact that there were observable shifts occurring in Nigerian leadership. And again, they follow on to use direct quotes to talk about shifts. They link it to gender equality and so forth. And later on in their discussions and hierarchy and so forth, they link back and they use some of this data to support and justify and verify the other arguments that academics and their interviewees have made. Okay, so that's the kind of gold standard. You can see there at the top of the page, they're using traditional references that they're citing. And then also in their characterized leaders section, you can see at the very beginning, they're citing survey data down the bottom. So already that survey data is being used to introduce rich information into other sections of the CP. So again, this is the kind of thing we're looking for you to do in your fourth draft. I want you to be skimming through your transcripts, looking over your highlighted sections, making sure you have those highlighted sections, and then incorporating them into your sections to tell a story, a flowing, coherent story. Similarly, again from Team Nigeria, they have a lovely mixture of synthesis here. The very first sentence in Nigeria, leadership styles tend to be highly structured and hierarchical. Moreover, there is a significant level of power distance insofar as most institutions favour a highly stratified structure. Reference to the interviewee, Adebayo, 10 March 2020. They then go on later on to include survey data as well. So they say, therefore, Nigerians will often address you with tremendous courtesy and explicit signs of respect, such as by using titles and honorifics rather than first names. They go on to say the importance of age was confirmed by one Nigerian manager who stated, then they have a direct quote. Okay, it's exactly what we're looking for. After that, they go along with age and class. The Nigerian hierarchy is also characterized by gender inequality. So, for all of you who are writing about hierarchy in your countries, I keep saying in some of the feedback, think about what is the basis of the hierarchy. Okay, what does it look like? Is it based on age, class, caste system, who you know, old boys network, friends, nepotism? Whatever it is, try and show what is it based on and show examples of it. Gender would be another example if I didn't mention it already. But again, hopefully you can see here how you incorporate and synthesize information into a flowing narrative. So again, almost finally now, we'll be finished for the night after this, guys. This is from Team Bahamas, and again, they're talking about hierarchy, so they're talking about Hofstede, of course. They're citing some other research that demonstrates Bahamas' score on power distance. But over the course of this chapter, as you can see, they have references to interviews. So they have Stringer, March 2020. They have Roll, March 2020. They have Monroe, March 21. And they also reference the CCBS survey for this information. So in this section, Bahamas were struggling, as you can probably see, to find academic literature on the country because of the size of the country and the lack of literature generally on leadership there. So they told that story through using survey data and interview data, okay? And crucially, synthesizing it together. Again, this is another example of a chapter from Team Belgium last year from their hierarchy section. And again, I'm just showing it to show you an example of what things should look like. They have academic references, they have 3 in that half paragraph alone, and they also use the CCBS survey data. And they do this to say this fact was also reflected in the CCBS survey, wherein every single respondent admired leaders on the basis of their organizational experience. So they're using the survey data to support, to extend, to confirm other things that are being found in other data that they're using, interviews, desk-based academic research, and so on and so forth. And finally, same again, in their empathy section at the end, you see a nice mixture of direct quotes from the CCBS survey. You see academic references cited at the same time. And crucially, as I keep saying, they're bringing it and synthesizing it together to tell a logical, coherent, and flowing argument. So again, I encourage you to look back at this video, to pause on these slides, to look at old examples of CPs and look at how people synthesize that material. Use it, as I say, to clarify, illustrate, summarize, confirm, contradict, critique what academic researchers have found about your country by showing them what real people who lived and worked in the country have to say about working in organizations there. Okay? And as I said at the beginning of the video, we're recording tonight, guys. So once it's posted up on Facebook tomorrow for you to view on YouTube, if you do have any questions, feel free to ask those questions under the comment section on the posting on Facebook. With that, I sincerely hope that tonight was useful. I hope it helped to illustrate, clarify, and maybe expand on some of the feedback that you've had individually in your team talks. And hopefully it's kind of been a nice way of illustrating to you where I'm coming from and what we're looking for in the specific sections of your CP. And most importantly, how we want you to synthesize all of this different data together to tell a rich, impactful, localized story about the country you're investigating.